Hi, welcome to another education offering by Workforce Systems Design. The topic of this presentation is National Debt in the United States, Impact on the U.S., Your Business, and Your Future. Originally, this was created to help business leaders understand the impact that the national debt was having in their organizations and on their workforce. It's been modified to be used as a guest lecture in colleges of business across the country in helping business students understand the impact that the national debt has on them and what they might do to prepare to engage people in dialogue around the national debt and its impact in the workplace. Before we go any further, here's a disclaimer. This information is not political in nature. In fact, if you look across the political gambit, you will see that both people from Republican parties, Democrat parties, and those who think independently have not managed our national debt well. I will provide information just as I found it, and all of it can be referenced through links that are provided in the slides or in the reference section, so that you can do your own research and make your own assumptions. The national debt has increased from about 1.5 trillion in the early 1990s to present day in June of 2023 to about 31.7 trillion. You can see that the debt has increased over time, starting with the Bush administration in the early 90s. You can see that over a 4-year period, it went from about 2.5 trillion to almost doubling to 5 trillion. In fact, members of this particular president's party were considering drawing up articles of impeachment because the national debt had reached more than 1.5 trillion. Over the next 8 years, you saw a steady increase from about 5 trillion to somewhere in the neighborhood of about $6 trillion. In the early 2000s, we began to see a significant increase from about 5 trillion to somewhere in the neighborhood of about 10 trillion, again doubling. There were a lot of situations, social situations, military situations, world events that had impacted the United States, and that debt was captured as a result. In the mid to late 2000s, we saw an exponential growth in debt from about 10 trillion to somewhere in the neighborhood of about 17.5 to 18 trillion dollars. We then saw it move into the $20 trillion range in the mid 2000 teens, so around 2015, 2016. We then saw another period of growth from 20 trillion to around 25 trillion. Some of this was related to the pandemic, some of it was related to economic crisis, and then present day we've seen it go up even more to $31.7 trillion. Again, this is not intended to be political. We just typically talk about national debt in terms of periods, and in this case, it was easy to talk about it in terms of presidential periods. Now, this next slide may seem a little more political. The graphics are horrible. Please understand there was no intent to make fun of President Reagan's Bush, Clinton, other Bush, Obama, Trump, or Biden, but these are just the graphics that came with the slide that I'm sharing with you. You can see that in 1981, we had about $1 trillion in debt, and again, at the same time, we saw tax revenue of about the same. So just over $500 billion in revenue, and a little more than that, actually almost double that, in debt. As we move through, we see that revenues increased, but debt increase at a much higher rate. So from 1 trillion to 2.5 trillion, 2.6 trillion, from about a half trillion in revenue to 1 trillion in revenue. And we see this trend continuing throughout. To the point in 2022, we had about $5.6 trillion in revenue. That means we had mostly tax collection coming in at close to $6 trillion. Yet our total debt at that time was just under 30 trillion. So from 1980 to 2023, we saw roughly 1 trillion to 30 trillion in debt. When we look at total revenue per year, roughly 1 trillion to 6 trillion from 1980 to 2023. What complicates this is inflation. Again, we've organized it by president just for reference points, but you can see that inflation on average was very high in the 1970s, began dropping very significantly in the 2000s, late 2000s, and then began to increase again. At the time of this slide, the interest rate has come down to inflation rate has come down to about 7.75 from about 9% inflation. So roughly 1980s, if you had $100, the way inflation impacts this is now around 2022, 2023, you would need $365 to buy the same good. Another way we like to look at it is if you had $10,000 in a period of time that was marked by a president. So in the 1970s to 1981, if you had 10,000, by 1989, you would have had to have 14,000 to buy the same goods that you bought with the 10,000 previously. Same here, if you had 10,000 in 1989, you would need approximately 12,000 in 1993 to buy the same goods that $10,000 would have purchased. As we go through this, so if you had 10,000 during this time period between 2009 and 2017, you would have needed 11,000 some odd to buy $10,000 worth of good. And then finally, if you had $11,054 in this time period, today you would need roughly 13,000, almost 14,000 to buy the same goods. And we know that because when we look at the purchasing power of $100 in 2003, you would need approximately $163 for that same purchasing power. Just to make it a little bit more real, if you purchased a very well-equipped Honda Accord in 2003 and it cost you $19,000, that same Honda today would cost you roughly $31,600. Again, you can reference this information at the bottom of the slide if you'd like to explore more. So why should you care about this? You should care about it because in 2000, we were roughly collecting $2 trillion worth of revenue, and we were budgeting around 1.7 trillion in expenses. There were some expenses that weren't budgeted, and at this time, we had accumulated a U.S. debt of 5.5 trillion. And so if you go to the U.S. debt clock, which a link is provided for you at the end of the presentation, roughly that would have meant that every U.S. citizen would owe the U.S. government $18,000 to cover that debt. You see that from 2000 to 2010, revenues per year increased slightly, but budget doubled and U.S. debt increase. By 2020, we were collecting 3.4 trillion, budgeting 4.5 trillion, and our debt was now 20 trillion. 2021, again, not much of an increase in revenues, but the budget increased. And to be fair, some of this was during the COVID pandemic, and the administration was trying to account for lost employment as well as a massive vaccination program. But regardless, we ended up with around $26 trillion. So now every individual U.S. citizen has a tax burden, unpaid, of about $84,000. And so we reached today, 2023, we have a whopping $9 trillion of revenue coming in. Budget is 6 to 7 trillion, but we also have a lot of unfunded activities. So now the debt is 31 trillion. Every citizen owes 95,000. Now, not every citizen pays taxes. So in 2023, the tax burden, if you look at the debt per taxpayer, is roughly $247,000 that we all owe in order to pay that debt down. This actually gets to a principle in economics we talk about as scarcity and choice. We are making choices, but we're not funding those choices completely. So at some point, we're going to have to make a decision about what we pay for and what we don't pay for. Again, why should you care about that? Right now, when we pay interest, and this is interest paid over from 2007 to 2023. So in 2007, we were paying roughly $250 billion a year in interest payments on the U.S. debt that we had. It went down slightly, came back up, went down slightly again to where we are today. When we prepare a budget, when Congress authorizes a budget, about $500 billion of that is going to pay interest on the U.S. debt. Put that in context, we spend about $800 billion a year on defense, $700 billion a year on education. And in food stamps, we only spend $120 billion. So that $500 billion in interest is going to pay our debt instead of taking care of our citizens. So if you put this national approach into an individual perspective over the same timeline from about 2000 to 2023, I made $100,000 in 2000. I spent about 83 in shelter and food and other things, and I had 17,000 left over, and that could either go into my retirement, it could go to a vacation, it could go to buying a new vehicle, it could go into any other discretionary activity I chose. By 2020, that same, with cost of living increases and some promotions perhaps, that same salary, or that salary of now $125 versus expenses of $160,000 plus in expenses, which means that, you know, if you were a business student just graduating and you were hoping for that great new first job, you're already in debt. There's no money for your savings. We continue to 2023, and now because inflation is eating into our $125,000, that same salary is only $113,000, right? And my expenses are still increasing, $171,000. So you can see at some point, if I were the U.S. government, I would be in a lot of trouble because I'm only making $113,000 a year, but I'm spending $170,000 a year. And it looks like the trend is I'm continuing to do that. So again, if you spent like the federal government, the average person would have an annual income of $33,000, and they would be spending more than they made every year, so they've got to borrow that from mom or a girlfriend or boyfriend or some kind of friend, or hope that someone's going to give them some charity, and they would already be $760,000 in debt. So why is it relevant to business students? It's relevant to business students in the same way that it is other employers. Every time you spend money paying interest, just as you were spending money paying interest on your credit cards, that would be interest that you're not investing, saving, or using in some other fashion. For business students, it's also relevant because we have a generation of people who continue to spend more than they bring in, no matter how much they bring in. And that debt, someday, just like your personal credit card, is going to come due. The other thing is, when we're in debt, we make decisions that may not be the best decisions. If you had $100,000, or in our case earlier, if you had $800,000 in credit card debt, and someone asked you to do something illegally or unethically or maybe immorally, you might be tempted to do that because that debt is so heavy hanging over your head, you want to have it removed. We're already seeing this in a global way where countries have borrowed money. They couldn't afford to pay that money back, and in order to erase the debt, another country would ask them to vote a certain way in the United Nations, or maybe they give them special rights to ports along their coastline that they would not have normally given to another country. So if you want to think about it from a biblical perspective, since many of the schools that we speak to have a historical Christian aspect, owe nothing to anyone, although some godly Christians such as George Mueller believe that this phrase prohibits all borrowing, and so, indeed some other religions prohibit all borrowing. There are some aspects that allow us to experience debt and borrow, but with an understanding that when you become a borrower, you find a new master. And when you owe someone, as Proverbs 22:7 says, you actually become that person's slave or servant. You will adhere to their bidding more than you perhaps would have your own. So, last thought, pay your taxes, but be active and informed and ask questions. If you see a government, state, local, or federal, spending resources that are not consistent with your belief system, or they have no way of funding, then ask questions, write letters, engage your political structures. So I hope this has been an interesting topic for you. I hope that you will continue to explore it. If you're interested in observing the U.S. debt clock, you can find it in several places. Just type into your search engine, U.S. debt clock, and you'll be amazed at the information that is available for you to make decisions. So thank you for your attention. If you have other questions, feel free to reach out to us. You can reach me, Richard Ray, at rraywsd@aol.com, or you can reach me at my office, rray@workforcesd.com. Thank you and have a great day.